history is written by the winners. But here on Americans Watching the Footy, we're here to talk about the losers. Welcome to part 1 of 2 of So You Didn't Crack the 8, 2024 edition.
Ethan and Benjamin Castle are Americans. Watching the Footy.
Liam Ryan saying, kick it my way, I want to jump over the pack, and here he comes! Ryan!
This is Buddy Franklin! This is the greatest showman!
Got the handball off to Myers. Myers looking for the lead of Stengel. Gee, they're good. Gee, they're sharp. Razzle dazzle Rioli.
Oh, who else? McDonald!
From inside the centre square. Boys kick the goal. Boys kick the goal. From inside the centre. I can't believe
that. Good time of day from South San Francisco, California. I am Benjamin Castle here alongside my brother Ethan and his cat, my nephew, Brian Harambe. And it's the 3rd edition of one of my favorite projects. I think I came up with this idea initially, but I think it was also inspired by something that you did once with baseball. Yeah, back in the throes of COVID, one year you had this baseball podcast with some of your friends, and you did this big project on your own where you looked at all the teams that didn't make the playoffs. And that's part of what got the ball rolling for this show in general, and in terms of this project in particular. A nice way to fill the men's pre-finals break. So we're going to split this up into 2 episodes covering 5 clubs each. And in order to keep things fresh for us and for you, we're just going to go to the trusty wheel here. I've got that prepared, and let's spin for the first non-finalist we'll cover. And we are starting with, it's between 2 of the black wedges, it's Essendon.
Ooh, okay.
The Ballers finished in 11th at 11-11-1, but they had the 15th best percentage at 93.5. It was 5% below Melbourne, and then a major drop-off from them to the bottom 3. They started 8-2-1, then lost 9 of their last 12.
They did have some really challenging trips during that whole 12-game stretch. You know, they had to play Carlton at the G. They had to play Geelong at the G. They had to play Melbourne at the G. They had to play the Crows at Marvel. They had to play the Saints at Marvel. They had to play the Suns at Marvel. They had to play the Swans at Marvel. You know, they were really racking up the miles, and that can definitely take its toll on a team.
Looking back at those 8 wins, though, that they racked up in the first half of the year, that early record is really deceiving, not just because of the way they finished, but also because of who they beat. Even the wins over finalists in that window, and there were 3 of those against Hawthorn, the Bulldogs, and the Giants. Those were while those future finalists were in their weaker patches. Remember, the Hawks started 0-5. The Bulldogs had a bit of a lull in the second quarter of the season, and people were really concerned about the Giants during that time. I don't think they beat any finalists really while they were actually hot. And then in their final 7 games, their only win was a 1-pointer against Freo,
which was a pretty awesome ending to a game. I don't want to undermine how badass that was. The behind to win was just like, shit, get downfield as fast as you can, and it actually worked. That was pretty awesome. I will acknowledge that.
I don't think that was a case where they intentionally kicked a behind.
No, it was just, we need a score.
Yeah, it's not like, I still contend that Steel Sidebottom last year intentionally kicked a behind to beat Adelaide in Adelaide. There were always questions about the actual game in, game out selection for this team. I mean, that's the case for any squad, but I think the ones we had the most difficulty parsing throughout the year were these guys along with the Bulldogs.
I'd say Bulldogs take the cake, and then I'd still put like the Crows and a couple others in a tier above Essendon, although there were a couple of weird ones, like when they were dropping like Nick Cox or Nick Hines.
Nick Hines now delisted. Now he is 30, and maybe they're trying to look ahead, but I feel like there's something missing there.
There were a couple other really weird ones.
The reason why I think Essendon's was so peculiar to me was because there was still a pattern in how the Crows and some others were keeping guys out. This, it felt even more arbitrary.
Felt like it was just kind of happening.
I remember Peter Wright was kept out for a number of games near the end of the year, and that opens up some questions about the forward look long term. Now, of course, we like Nate Caddy, and Harry Jones did a lot to go from the wing into the 50, but for someone who has been such a prominent goal kicker for you to be left out,
and rather quickly, it was after like what, 1 or 2 down games, it was odd timing. Whereas like you look at the Charlie Dixon one, it's like it was a lengthy enough pattern that, well, it was still surprising just because it's Charlie Dixon.
Wright had 2 goals each, rounds 15, 16, and 17 against West Coast, Geelong, and Collingwood. Goalless against Melbourne, in which he was subbed out. Maybe some of that was because that was a wetter game and it didn't favor Tulls in the first place. And then he only played 1 game the rest of the year, and that was the loss to the Saints, where they just got absolutely spanked.
Also, you have, a super high draftee from a couple years ago in Elijah Sadas, who just hasn't gotten his chances.
And wasn't Ben Hobbs a somewhat high draft pick as well, who's only starting to get a little bit of something? Yeah, he was pick 13 in 2021, and he's been starred for a lot of opportunities. 12 games this year, but 4 of those as the sub. This is a team that I think finds himself just in a very in-between state, where the start to the season makes them think, oh yeah, we can actually be in this for the long run with the guys we got up top. Then the bottom falls out, and really the back falls out, and you realize, no, we've got a ways to go. I guess I'd lean more toward shelving things for a couple years and try to build up with the youth. Again, you've got Sadas and Hobbs and some others that you can easily work in, but first and foremost, you need to solve the problems in terms of intercepting at halfback, because you've got plenty of ball movers there. Redmond, McGrath, Nick Martin has been played back there. Xavier Durza, actually, I like shifting between 50s. He's got some good intercepting reads there, but he also has some soft tissue problems. Thinking about who my sleeper was for this year was Zach Reed, who, of course, because he's Zach Reed, only got 1 game and nearly immediately got hurt in round 1. Just need that intercepting class in the defensive 50, especially with Dyson Heppel now retired. And Mackay alone can't do that. In fact, he was relatively derpy this year. And as much as I talk about good ball movement from the back, a lot of that can get quelled if you just look at what happened this past week at the Gabba.
My sleeper was Jai Menzie, who had a couple moments, but I think he's fallen down kind of like that forward hierarchy, especially with like Nate Caddy's emergence that have gotten taller with a couple of those spots.
Menzie was one of the, it was the repeated question, why is he staying in? From Essendon supporters. Man, I can think of a guy who could have really helped this team. 2, in fact.
Massimo D'Ambrosio.
And, because he wouldn't be the main guy in the back,
Brandon Zerk-Thatcher. That one's a little tricky.
Admittedly, Zerk-Thatcher's had an up and down year with Port.
But yeah, the depth there would have been nice. I think my other thing was like, I saw the ceiling in a lot of different players, and it just rarely happened at the same times. Like at the start of the year, Sam Durham was very good. Archie Perkins was really solid. Durham was okay later in the year. Perkins really fell off and even got omitted a few times. See, he's what I think, like that future that you were hinting at kind of hinges a lot on what he does. And then, later in the year, a healthy Dylan Shield actually played really well. And I thought Jai Caldwell was pretty solid as a clearance guy who wasn't overly sloppy. And that's a guy who like doesn't have to play with the most finesse, but actually was pretty smooth when he needed to be.
It's a mix there that goes outward from Zach Merritt, or really is built around it because Merritt can flex out. But there's got to be more than one piece in there that holds it all together. So can that be Caldwell? I think they've backed him in for that. How do you fit Martin in there? What can Shield and Durham continue to give?
I also, outside of Kyle Langford and I guess now Caddy, I just don't see like that forward hierarchy, like guys that are going to routinely get you, 1 to 2 goals every week. Like where's some of that scoring coming from?
Are they trying to figure Sam Draper into that mix long term because he spent more time forward in the final month and a half? That, though, would hinge on better ruck play and just more time for Nick Bryan and or Todd Goldstein. At this point, you'd back in Bryan. That's another thing. The whole ruck planning and splitting of time just didn't feel right a lot of the year.
At the end of the year, Nick Bryan actually playing pretty well and then getting subbed out. It was just like, what is the purpose of this? Was really what didn't make sense to me. I didn't see an objective in it.
Looking at the Essendon list in terms of who can actually be a forward factor long term, On the smaller end, you're waiting for the real emergence for the Davies, Allen Jr. and Jaden. Allen did get a little time.
He had his moments.
A lot of players, though, had their moments. I think not having Matt Guelphy in the back of the year really hurt because he can also take on the defensive responsibility. We highlighted his performance in a couple games this year where he both got a couple goals and also helped lock down one of the defenders.
I like Matt Guelphy. I think he is one of those kind of make shit happen guys.
At the start of the year, we called him the showerhead. He was less of that distributor this year.
He created some chaos in a positive way in those forward lines, is how I would describe it.
Help get things to ground. That's where players like Jade Gresham can pitch in more.
Like, there are some teams where chaos is not a good thing, but you need at least like one chaos guy, especially in the forward line. I don't think it's a coincidence that the team that kind of lacked that chaos had a lot of lower scores. Like, I think of, it was wet, but like the really ugly Melbourne game where they lost to a team missing Max Gawn.
Looking at the contract situations here, Peter Wright still has 3 more years on his deal. So what's the move there? Is he going to be backed in to fit into that forward mix more, or are they selling him at this point? I'm not sold on either option.
Yeah, I think the overarching question here is just like, what's the plan?
Who are you people?
What does a really strong contending Essendon team look like? What is the personnel for it?
And through all this, it was a similar arc to last year. The bigger start, then the letdown, finished with 11 wins and in 11th, just like they did in 2023.
It was like a more exaggerated, dramatic version of last year. I think that's a fair way of putting it, yeah?
Yeah, I just have...
The drama seemed a lot higher. The reaction seemed a lot bigger.
Also, it looks like Jake Stringer has hit a trigger for another year in his contract. He was seeking 2 years, but there was potential also for him to be dealt out. That's another question mark. There are more question marks on this team than any other punctuation. Whereas there are more definites and more positives to look at in terms of a lot of these non-finalists for the future. I still don't really, like you, Ethan, see much of a plan, and I'm not sold on what Brad Scott's done.
This team seems like it's to the point where they're just kind of wandering in the middle. And I just want to understand, like, what is like this team's end game with all of this?
How do other fans see it? How does the coaching staff see it?
There are worse places you could be as a club, but this is not a fun place. And just, this team has had a pretty nasty habit of getting punched in the dick. It's one thing to just lose. It's, to be the loser of the last 3 after the Siren games is pretty brutal. I think it's funny because I'm not an Essendon fan, but if I was one, I'd be miserable.
And when was Essendon's last after the Siren winner?
I believe it was 1912 against University.
1913.
Ah, yes.
By Jimmy Gordon.
Yeah, everyone remembers old Jimmy.
Who was killed in World War I. At least he never knew that it would be World War I.
Ready to spin the wheel again already?
I think we've given Essendon their due here. On we go to a more promising team, but one where the disappointment is more immediate and raw.
Freo?
These things happened. They were glorious. They changed the world. And then Freo fucked up the end game.
I was super high on Freo into 2022. They made me look pretty smart. Then they decided to play the long game instead of trying to seize on that, which seemed odd. Down year in 23, couple of poor trade periods in a row. And then this year, you started to see like, okay, I get how they're playing for 25 to 27, maybe even this coming year. Maybe we're really getting towards something. And then they lost their final 4. They were 1-6-1 in games within 13 points. And yeah, this team went from having very real top 4 aspirations to Bali, Mad Monday. Have we seen anybody's Mad Monday stuff yet?
Crows hit the golf course in old-timey gear, I know. But yeah, at this point, it could be Bali or Thailand or here. Yeah, come through.
Yeah, I see the Crows one. Richmond. Okay, Richmond had a bunch of kids show characters.
I think Adelaide just put on their best Payne Stewart look, which is fitting because their season also kind of felt like a plane crash.
So Freo, obviously, end of the season, bad. We get that.
Key injuries at the wrong times.
The wrong combination of key injuries more than anything. You could have afforded one of Alex Pearce or Sean Darcy or Josh Tracy, maybe even 2, but all 3, that really hurt. And then you're left relying on Liam Reedy. I thought Pat Voss did fine in a fill-in role.
More magnified, taller job, I guess, for Sam Sturt as well. And Sturt's flexible in that sense. But yeah, all 3 at once. And the fact that Pierce came back probably a week too soon, and it came back to bite him as well.
Came back a week too soon in a game where they totally didn't need him against a depleted Melbourne squad,
whom they had already eviscerated earlier in the year.
Like, that was the high point, the Wiedemann to be taken seriously. You know, going into Alice Springs and winning by like 91, was it, I believe?
92.
You know, hindsight, you could obviously point to the kick that was touched that was called a mark for Carlton, especially considering that Carlton's the one who got in at their expense.
You could take a look at something in that Collingwood draw around 11.
The Sydney game, the parameters, obviously, you know, with Cam McCarthy's passing didn't help, but it's like they did everything except kick straight. You had a derby where they just got beat up. That's honestly one that you can just like, yeah, they had a crappy game and the Eagles had a good game. I wouldn't even like look at that one too much, as funny as that sounds.
Frustrating that not only was it the derby, I mean, not frustrating for me, but that it came off those 2 super narrow losses in the elongated Adelaide trip.
Yeah, where I thought they would be ready to do. They were not ready to do. You also had the loss to the Bulldogs where they just got crushed, where that was like dogs at their best, Dockers at their worst. That's another, it's just like, oh, that wasn't fun, but it happens.
And then they won 5 of their next 6.
The Launceston loss was an issue. That felt like a game that they controlled most of the way and should have won.
So what did work for this team? Well, a lot. Each position group and the team as a whole showed promise, but not always together, and obviously not at the very end. In terms of the midfield, you knew that you had a strong duo in there before we were on the trio, especially you, Mr. Hayden Young enjoyer.
Yes, I am the Hayden Young fan.
I think he might actually be the best runner of all 3 of them.
I don't just like him running. I like just his longer kicks through the middle. He's someone who like doesn't have to have all that many contested possessions to be a super impactful player.
Yeah, it can be more Sarong and Brayshaw at the source and finding ways for Young to run. Because this team has plenty of runners on the outside with Jordan Clark and Jeremy Sharp, who was your sleeper this year. You nailed that. I saw Clark as like less of an outside runner and more as running from the back. And I mean, his best sequences came when like he wasn't just racking up disposals, but like he would start things from the back, run, handball, and then just keep running with it. And those runs would be a bit more on the flank, less so through the quarter. So I still think of him as an outside runner, though not nearly as confined to the outside as Sharp was. It's as if Jeremy Sharp was just magnetically drawn to the boundaries all season. I thought that like Nathan O'Driscoll was going to play the other wing at the end of the year, and instead he actually got more in the middle, and he was like one of the encouraging signs as this season fell apart. So, like, I am still pretty optimistic about this team going ahead, but there are questions like, you know, what is Matt Johnson's role? How do you incorporate an aging Michael Walters, who seems to have a lot of soft tissue injuries? Well, it looks like there could be a couple replacements on the way.
Yeah, a couple of very talented replacements, but it's like, how do these guys exactly fit in everything?
I feel like it could even further squeeze out my sleeper in Tom Evatt, whose pressure I love, but wasn't able to get into games consistently in the back part of the year. It's rare to see him and Bailey Banfield in games together, and Banfield just got signed on for a couple more, despite a really lackluster end to the season. So the small ranks feel very unsettled. And so, yeah, how much they're actually able to bring in terms of Shea Bolton and potentially Kazi Pickett and maybe Liam Baker, though I think he'd lean Eagles.
Yeah, it seems like he'd have much more of an opportunity there. Seems like just as a midfielder, he'd be like the number 4 guy, and it would be a hell of a midfield. But
I like the younger class, though, for this Freo team in general. Amos and Tracy are still quite young to be as prominent as they are up forward. And that triumvirate in the middle is all on the younger side too. So the pieces are there, and you've got the draft picks to leverage things this year. They got 3 first-rounders. So if there's a time to go for it, it's now, but it's got to be delivered very quickly, because I think Justin Longmire starts 2025 with a warmer seat after this late collapse.
My other concern is just like, what sort of carryover effect will the end of season collapse have to like the psyche of this team moving ahead? That's my biggest concern. It's not a lack of talent or ability. Like, this is a team that should absolutely be in the mix next year. But, is this the sort of thing that, like, you don't recover from and it really tears you apart?
Was that supposed to be a pun based on round 24?
No, not at all, actually. I was just like, you think about how, like, some teams, they never recover from, like, if this isn't 28-3, but that's a pretty good example.
Or just after getting blown out in an important game, like after losing Super Bowl 35, 34-7, the New York Giants didn't get back to prominence until they retooled everything. So next year, regardless of who is brought in, it has to be the referendum year for Longmire and company. And it might take more than a finals berth for anybody to be convinced.
The other question with this team, comes down to the style they play. Are they too content just controlling possession instead of attacking? I think that is a thing that they do at times.
Simpson-like?
A little bit Ross Ball-like.
I mean, Longmire is cut from the Simpson cloth. He was part of that staff there, and this is a team that doesn't do nearly as well in chaos. I highlighted that in our round 24 recap. I mean, Port is an exceptional chaos ball team, but Frio I wouldn't put in the top half, even the top 2/3 of that.
Yeah, and that's something that this team has to get better at.
Bolton and Pickett could provide that, but they also just bring chaos with them.
The other thing with this team is just, it was bad sequencing. If this 4-game losing streak had happened earlier, and they nearly made it into finals, and they made their way up to 9th after a disappointing 23, you'd be like, all right, flag mantle somewhere from 25 to 27, totally back on, all is well. Just learn how to win close games and you're set.
Instead, this was an incredibly streaky team who started the year by winning 3, losing 3, then going 4-1-1 into the bye, terrible loss after, 5 of 6 wins, and 4 losses to plummet. I think the formula for success is more defined for this team, even before the potential trades are made. It's just got to happen. 2 teams down out of 10. Let's hit one more before the break here. And we are going back to Victoria, to Collingwood, in fact. There was a whole swath of this wheel that was all Victorian in a row, and it landed on Collingwood within that. Collingwood finished 12-9-2, 102.5%. They had the 10th best percentage. They finished 9th on the ladder. They dropped 8 places from last year, ended up missing finals on percentage, 7.7% to be specific. They go from 18 wins down to 12, but also from only 5 losses to 9. Remember, this team had 2 draws. Then went on a really nice run, going 8-1-2, and then lost 4 straight. And then the collapse against the Swans put an end to things. They still did pretty well in close games, most notably 2 over Carlton by a combined 9 points, another close win over the Crows, comeback against North, and the comeback against the Lions. The question that I am left with after this season is, how much was this season paying the flag tax? How much was regression? You're more likely after a longer season to have more injuries. You're playing a tougher schedule. You've got a shorter offseason, but also like that stretch from the second half of 2022 on through like all of 23 seemed like in a lot of ways, 99th percentile, just like everything going right. A lot of things just breaking their way. And not too many injuries in one spot on the list, where they really hurt in the key stocks on both ends of the oval this year, particularly forward. This is a team that had the leading goal kicker kick 30, and that was Bobby Hill. Bobby Hill, I thought it was a down year for him. Schultz, I also look at as someone who, it took him a while to get going. He looked better as the year went on, but he's going to have to show something next year to prove that he was worth the first rounder, because first impressions count for a lot. The most obvious answer would just be that the reality is somewhere in the middle, where this team paid the flag tax with an older list and largely untested depth, kind of like Geelong a year prior, where if you were to run, 1,000 simulations, this team realistically ends up somewhere 5th. From the last 2 years, you can get a sort of mean. Yeah, basically, that's kind of what I was getting at. Well, let's see what kind of regression there is for a team that is definitely going to stay on the older side in some ways. Pendlebury, Sidebottom, Howe, they've all signed on. But they also did have, in part because of injuries, in part because of
performance. They got to see some of the younger guys who all had flashes at times, like Ed Allen, that was really in round 24. Will Parker, another late season burst. And then Joe Richards and Lockie Sullivan was more like middle of the season.
We'll see if Richards stays. He's being courted by Port pretty intensely, it seems, which for such a short stint at the top level is a bit surprising. Sullivan was the one to fill in a lot when DeGoey was out. But in terms of the long-term look, I do like Allen as part of the center there. I was surprised he only got 2 games because he debuted against his father's side, Frio. His father is Ben Allen, the inaugural Fremantle captain, and then in round 24. And there are some who have been talked about a lot this year. Your sleeper, Harry Di Mattia, struggled with injuries and then didn't get a game. We didn't see any of Jacob Ryan this year. So there are still a lot of question marks on the younger side. And it seems like they're going to prolong those questions for one final ride for the older group.
The question you worry about, does this turn into like a Red Wings type thing?
I mean, they're not bringing in a bunch of old guys too.
Yeah, that is true.
For reference, the Detroit Red Wings were a dynasty in the NHL ice hockey around the turn of the millennium, won another Stanley Cup in 2008, and just kept trying to restock with cup-chasing veterans and couldn't get another. Collingwood's definitely holding on to this here in a way that is maybe a bit more than what Geelong has been doing. I mean, I think some of the Geelong stuff was ushered in by Selwood retiring immediately after winning, as Geelong captains are wont to do.
The big question, I think, heading into this offseason is how do you replace Nathan Murphy? Because that ended up being a really significant loss.
It put Darcy Moore into a more difficult spot in terms of one-on-ones, and he wasn't ever able to fully get into that, though he did have some bright spots, I'd say, around the third quarter of the season.
It was also not helpful for Isaac Quainer.
Really?
So he and Moore, like in 22 and 23, were just intercept machines.
Moore and Quainer also had Billy Frampton going back and forth between forward and back. I strongly believe the solution is back, especially if a combination of Dan McStay and Nathan Kruger can stay healthier, along with the return of Brody Majacek, whose absence I think was underrated. He had been one of the most consistent goal kickers of the league since he debuted in the middle of the 2018 season, and Collingwood lost a lot without him. Not that he's a huge target, but he's one that has to be occupied.
I actually like having Frampton forward with the job of just like tie up the opposing team's best defender.
Then who do you have in the back in the meantime?
Yeah, that's tough because you can also throw Jeremy Howe forward.
I don't think Howe is enough, though.
Yeah, it's tough.
In the immediate, the answer, I think, is Frampton back. But this is also a team that doesn't have a whole lot in terms of draft pick stock because they don't have a first rounder this year. Are they going to bargain things? Are they going to bargain a future first or second in order to get that missing defensive piece?
If you're going all in for this thing, I think you kind of have to look at something like that.
And with John Noble requesting out to Gold Coast, do you try to get a higher pick from them and get that flip? That's another possibility. The highest you get is their second because it seems like the first will be for Dan Rioli. But try to push the Suns into a higher bid and flip that? Because I don't see much else going Collingwood's way in terms of trading.
You're probably going to have to find a few more like scrap heap guys at some point.
And my sleeper pick, Charlie Dean, could help there in defense, but didn't get super consistent time there. They were trying to retool and find that right mix all season long. Dean played a total of 8 games and went 3-4-1. Mostly played near the middle of the season around the bye. And he's obviously a supporting piece there. Even though Darcy Moore has been the focus all along, this Collingwood defensive group had been centered around Nathan Murphy. And now that they're without that on the Oval, they've got some defensive reckoning to do. I think the one player for Collingwood with the most interesting arc this season, though, was Steele Sidebottom.
He looked washed at the start of the year, then really took on things pretty well, and all of a sudden it was like, hey, you're actually going to be a tagger now, and it totally worked.
From inside and looking out of it, to outside and being with it, still holding his own on the way in terms of speed and disposal, to then go inside and do some pretty impressive tagging jobs. after Jack Viney did a really nice job in rounds 22 and 23, Sidebottom quieted him to end the year. So how much do you keep Sidebottom there? What's the story with Tom Mitchell going forward? And it feels like from there, figuring out where the veterans are in things, how do you fill the gaps for this next year with the youngsters?
You know, Benjamin, 78% of our listeners are between 18 and 35 years old, so they probably want to start a podcast like we did.
How did you know that number, Ethan?
Thanks to the analytics we have for Spotify for Podcasters.
Formerly known as Anchor, sorry Frio fans, Spotify for Podcasters has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast from your phone or your computer. No fancy software needed.
It's so easy you can edit it while drunk.
And Spotify for Podcasters doesn't just allow you to upload to Spotify, you can also distribute your podcast on platforms like Apple, Stitcher, and more, just like we do.
Best of all, it's completely free.
Not only is it free, you can even make money from listener support or ad revenue. Hint, hint.
Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to podcasters.spotify.com to get started today. You know the deal, unless you're new here, which if you are, welcome. On Twitter, @AmericansFooty, and we're on Instagram. We've got a Linktree page. I'm on Twitter @Castle Media. Brian Harambe is on Instagram @CatNameGrian.
I am @BenjaminHK01, and X-Wing is @Aliciousness.
2 more for this episode, since this is part 1 of 2.
We've got 4 Victorian teams left and 3 that aren't. And we are going to a non-Victorian team. The Mighty Sun, at home until they weren't, and then on the road suddenly.
The 13th place Gold Coast Suns, they finished 11 and 12, 99.1%. Their percentage was also 13th, barely behind the Crows. This team set their record for wins. It was also their second best percentage in club history, and they did improve by 2 wins, 2 ladder places, and about 7%, but had major trouble winning on the road until Mac Andrew after the siren, which was really badass. They started to try to get some of those guys into the 2023 Academy class in the games, and then that tapered off some, with the exception of keeping Sam Closey and Will Graham in. I like those guys. I also thought Bodie Hewlin started to break out nicely.
And note that Closey wasn't really part of that direct Academy class. He came back after playing in the VFL, I think with Werribee, but did go through the Academy. If you're talking about that Academy quartet, though, it would be Walter, Reed, Rogers, and Graham. And I think out of those 4, it's Graham that got the most consistent time and showed the most progress within the season. And I think had his most in-tune game yet with the ball in round 24, kicking 2-1 from 16.
Noah Anderson and Sam Flanders got a lot of the ball. Sometimes they were impactful, sometimes they weren't. Maybe I'm just coming up with this myself, but I thought some of the comments that Hardwick made about, them needing to grow the fuck up and stuff was in reference to some of those guys that were just accumulating instead of actually really having an impact.
Was that after that Saints game, or when was it?
I believe it was the North loss.
Yeah, you're right. It was all within that similar stretch, though, because that Saints game wasn't too long before that. What was it, though, just with the home-away splits? Was there anything in it other than psychological?
I'm not sure. I will say things that quieted my concerns towards the end of the year was how Matt Rowell finished, after I thought he's just a guy who expends so much energy that he's kind of running on E before the season ends. I think he was able to dispel some of that, and you could make the argument that his struggles later in the year were in sync with when Tuke Miller was out. You could definitely make that argument. My big picture thing, I strongly doubt the 80% of a premiership team, first off.
Now, we thought that meant on the current AFL list, not even in terms of the upcoming Academy class and all that, and they will have Leo Lombard coming from that, and Bodie Hewlin's brother Zeke in another year. Yeah, he was full of shit.
My concern really is, you have the top of the list guys with Matt Rowell. You showed that you can make, a really great scrap heap find in Ben Long, which, if that's, the one missing link to cap things off, hell yeah. The problem is, what is there in between that? Who is the middle of the pack? Just be consistent, decent all the time, guys. I guess you could make a case for Alex Davies, but he wasn't getting stable time, and then he had a suspension. I just want to know, like, what is the middle of this team? Because, like, if Ben Long was picked up by, like, a team that was in this thing, was a contender from the start of the year, would have been like, wow, that was the one last piece to get him over the hump. Not to the level of, like, 2022 Tyson Stengel. That's, like, the best case example, but every flag-winning team seems to have some sort of find like that, whether it's a Marlon Pickett or just someone who kind of comes along unexpectedly. And the Friar Suns brain trust was not finding guys like that. So that is definitely encouraging. Yeah, I just want to know where, like, the consistent middle of this team is. Not, like, middle position-wise, just, like, who's going to be your 10th best player? Who's going to be your 12th best player? Those sort of dudes.
Do you think it is the right approach, what they're doing right now, and bringing in a couple veterans to try and fill things out? Because this list does still lean younger in some aspects. I'm not sure, because it's guys that I like. And if you believe that, shaping things from the back really sets everything up, then you should totally believe in this, with Daniel Rioli and John Noble likely to come in. But also, what makes this weird is, like, they've got a whole bunch of guys to move the ball out of the back. How do you make sure they don't step on each other's toes? I mean, I like the idea of getting Sam Flanders more into the middle, because when he did that at the very end of the year, it looked really nice. I would do more of that. I highly recommend that. But I think the question that needs to be asked is, what is your immediate priority? Is it just play in a final, or is it we don't care about actually being in a final if we're not legitimately winning this thing? That is the question that needs to be asked, because that'll shape what they're doing. And you don't want to get caught between the two. You need to have a vision. And if your vision is, if you're not first, you're last, really lean into that. And if your vision is just like, making a final will be important for our club's culture and for us being taken seriously, then you got to lean into that. What would your answer be?
I'm not sure. And I'm glad I'm not the one tasked with making that decision. It's different if you have the perspective, of being with the Suns and having not played a final. Whereas if you're coming from, where Hardwick's coming from,
having been to the mountaintop and also come back down.
Yeah, it's like, if he thinks if you're not first, you're last, well, I totally get what his perspective would be. So I'm not sure which of those is, like, the more appropriate approach. I hate bringing stuff up and just not having an answer, but I don't have the answer to that. That is something that people who are getting paid to do these things have to figure out. But, like, no other club would I really consider, like, the goal of just cracking the 8 in any sort of capacity is important. Because of the Suns' history, that is the only club where that should even be considered.
I think cracking a final will be a first step, but that can't be your only goal. So I would go more into the if you're not first, you're last idea. So don't get too crazy with the veterans. Allow Daniel Rioli and John Noble to be flexible because they've shown that ability. I think this could, though, we've talked about this, I know, off the air, crowd that half-back group. Does Lockie Weller get pushed out of things? Where does Will Powell go? Because this is a position group where you already have some dudes there. Up front, Ben King had, I'd say, about 2/3 of a good year, which for him, I'd say is all right. He still finished 4th in the Coleman despite his July inaccuracy with 55 goals. So that's a start there. And they're not just looking to him, but there have got to be some smaller players to take that next step. Bailey Humphrey needs to take the next step. We backed him in for multiple years now for it, and it's yet to happen.
That was one that I was thinking about when I was kind of brainstorming for this. Like, Bailey Humphrey needs to evolve into be a 1 or 2 goals a game guy instead of an all or nothing. Because we've seen a couple of games here or there, especially in Darwin, where he'll go and, like, kick 5, and then he'll also just get subbed out multiple weeks in a row. It's like, what you're now getting to the point where you've been in this thing long enough that you got to start to establish consistency. Like, the ceiling's cool, but consistency is much more needed right now.
And it sounds like Mal Rosas has been given the green light to pursue a way out.
Interesting. Like, I get how there might not necessarily be a spot for him, like a great spot for him. I also want to know, like, what do you plan on doing with Joel Jeffrey? Because I really like his upside, but that's another one who
could get squeezed out with the halfback edition.
Exactly. I mean, I liked him as a forward to begin with.
I did.
Maybe Rosas' departure would work to allow him to get back in there. I don't know.
Maybe would open things up for Jeffrey and Humphrey forward. Maybe it allows more opportunities for Lloyd Johnston to be in consistently. because he was your sleeper, so you can speak to him a bit, but he showed his flashes.
Yeah, I would like to see him get more time. It's another one that I guess trying to figure out how to incorporate both him and Bailey Humphrey can be a little bit tricky.
Well, hopefully they don't backflip on any decisions, but crash. Is that the one thing that people are going to remember about Lloyd Johnston this year?
Probably.
My sleeper pick was Connor Butterick, who was coming back from multiple ACLs and found some more games near the end of the season, but not enough for me to be really sold on anything. He's another piece there that was mentioned by multiple people in the media as being one of those next guys up for 2025, but now these other pieces are coming in.
I like hearing Dwayne Ruffle say, Butterick. So I guess, the guiding question for the Suns is what is the next step? There seems to be something of a baseline, but we need to know what the next step is.
And how far do you go with acquiring veterans, whereas you still do need to phase out others? Looks like Sam Day, an inaugural Sun, might be on his way out.
He still has value. Someone could find a way to utilize him. I just, I get when you have Jed Walter or something, it's tough. I mean, Levi Casbolt can get a game all year. This team's tall forward stocks are actually kind of crowded at the moment. So, inevitably, you know what happens then after you let a couple of guys go to a spot that's crowded, right?
You get a bunch of injuries there.
You get a bunch of injuries and it's well, shit, could have kept that guy around. That's just natural football stuff. That is so typical. So don't be surprised if/when that happens.
We're not trying to speak this into existence, but it happens so often.
Yeah, just don't be surprised.
Oh yeah, did we mention the Suns had their most wins ever this year?
Yes, we did.
It feels like it's lost in that mix. That even
you know what it is? It's because the road struggles, and it wasn't just road losses. It was a lot of blowout road losses, and the only ones that were close were the teams at the very, very bottom. And that you had, the first couple rounds was oh my God, the Suns, and then it just didn't happen. Malcolm Rose actually got me thinking about one last thing here. I know it was kind of under past management, but you look at what Isaac Rankin did as a Sun and what he's doing now, and you wonder, was this team getting the most out of their guys? I think it's very easy to question that. I think now it's probably better under new management, but it's still something to eyeball. One more spin, and then we're going to be done with this episode. Yeah.
So we've gotten some views from the Victorian crowd, gone to a couple other states, and we will finish with Melbourne.
Ooh, boy.
I'm just hearing the Simpson Louis quote in my head.
Whoa! Where did that come from? Whoa!
But in the worst way possible. This is a team that cratered out of the top 4 and into 14th. Their 10th-place drop is the largest from 2023. Their drop of over 26.7% is the second largest. And they started 6-2. And you can chalk some, if not a lot of that, up to the Petrarca injury, but not all of it.
Well, it started even before that with Angus Brayshaw's career ending. I know there was so much talk about the play itself and Braden Maynard, this and that. I think what got lost in all that is this was a very significant injury to a very important player that this team really relied on for a lot. And I think you saw, Clayton Oliver was playing through injuries, and who knows whether his future is at this club or somewhere else, but might not be a coincidence that he played a lot worse.
And then that just brings up questions of injury management as well between him and Petrarca.
And not just that, you look at Jack Viney, who, a very skilled player at times, but I don't think anyone has ever used the term finesse to refer to how Jack Viney plays. I don't think the term refined ever really describes his game. A couple of guys who had nice years, Trent Rivers took a big step forward. Alex Neal-Boland was excellent. Now he's headed out, so you got to maximize the trade value there.
That is to the Crows.
Absolutely have to get appropriate compensation for him because he did have a really nice year.
A really nice year, just a really nice career as a whole with Melbourne. It's a return purely for family reasons as he's starting his own decade veteran of the club and big part of that flag in 2021. But they did want some newer midfielders this year. Rivers getting more of that split than ever, and some primary roles at that will be good for his development. And you've got some new things coming in on the wing with Caleb Windsor and Colton Tolstrup. And we saw Tolstrup flex inside a bit as well.
Other than his game in his hometown, Perth, Tolstrup was pretty encouraging, and I really liked Windsor before he got hurt. So that is something to be optimistic about. But just like so many other things fell apart that, you look at obviously the Petrarca loss and all sorts of tabloidy sounding rumors there. That could be devastating. We'll see about Pickett. We'll see about Oliver. And then you've also got like Jake Bowie went from being the automatic win player to barely being able to crack the lineup, and the guys who were replacing him were hardly any better.
And honestly, I would not have had him in and would have rather seen Andy Moniz Wakefield and get more consistent down.
Someone who actually showed a bit of encouragement. Was he like, was I raving about him like I was raving about Lawson Humphreys? No, but he showed something. I think the biggest question about this team right now is not just the actual football, but culture stuff. Like, to fall off from such a high so quickly and have so many questions about if guys are going to want to be a part of your club going ahead is troubling, at least. It's like, are we in for another dark age of this club? Because I remember, when we first started watching footy, this was kind of just like, what's this silly, unremarkable team that has a funny song?
And the weird thing is, it was a lull for a year or two there after they had made a prelim, and they rebounded from it very quickly. I'm not sure if you can count on a second rebound under that same leadership.
And I feel like, we've heard a lot about like player drama and chemistry stuff. We haven't heard a lot about like what's actually going on behind closed doors with upper management. I guess good on them for keeping that stuff from leaking, but I feel like there's got to be something there because you do not feel a sense of harmony or chemistry. Other things to mention, let's see. They brought on Jack Billings. He was very poor until like one good game as a sub. So when you're losing a bunch of guys and you're not recruiting very well, that's not a good combo.
It forced a closer look into the youth movement. And we mentioned some pieces there with Windsor, Tolstrup, Moniz Wakefield minimally, Jacob Van Rooyen still on the younger side.
And he's just got into a point where I feel like pretty reliably confident in him. If he takes another step, that would be awesome. If he doesn't, and he's just a solid tall forward, you live with that too. There's just not a lot of reason for long-term optimism right now.
This is a club that for multiple reasons feels like its contention window is falling off the edge of a cliff.
There were a lot of bad things that happened that were out of their control. Injuries to like every key piece.
Stephen May in addition.
But the things that are within their control aren't working either. If I had to guess right now, just off of better luck, next year will not be as much of a train wreck. Well, not a team that I would back in to play finals again anytime soon.
Let's see how we view things in late October after the trade period. By the way, are you looking forward to going blind for that again?
Yeah, I'm hoping to really like stay disconnected this time and actually not have like the biggest one spoiled.
Yeah, so last year, Ethan had us try something that another podcast we both like, particularly him, the Baseball Barbacast, tries, where one of them goes dark for the last, I think, 24 hours before the trade deadline.
Yeah, they didn't do it this year, I think, but most years they do.
And then he just gets filled in all the rest. He guesses what happens sometimes. We tried that last year, and Ethan still found out about the Ginnivan trade.
Like, if there was one to not find out about, I mean, I would not complain if I find out about a Geelong thing sooner. I will not actively seek it out, but if I see something, that will not bother me. But when it's something like that, it's like, damn, I wish I didn't know that. I want to get the reaction, like, so, wait, what the fuck?
If we had to look at this younger wave for Melbourne and what has been clicking, in the back, more time into Blake House, not sold on him yet. Started the year all right, cooled off. Harrison Petty is still only 24. What is his future?
He looks so much older. I actually think if he's just like, forceful mark towards the mid half forward, I think he can be useful. Kind of like the rare taller half forward.
I always think about how Ben King was used before his ACL in that respect.
It's Ben.
Because you see taller wing marks. Harry Mackay's used that way a lot. Melbourne would use Ben Brown like that on the occasions in which he got in. Tom Sparrow's another 24-year-old Premiership piece who got injured at the end of the year, but I don't think was ever settled in either at midfield or half forward. And he was my sleeper going into this year, and I still don't feel great about his long-term position. Taj Wowoden was the perennial sub.
I don't think I particularly like the way Melbourne has handled perennial sub stuff between him or Toby Bedford. I don't think it's necessarily been conducive to the guys that have been picked to do that week in and week out to actually
take a next step. And being picked week in and week out for that is part of the problem. Just remember, if you don't get enough time on the ground as a sub, you got to run after, which again, stupidest thing. That is total eyewash. Also on the younger side, Daniel Turner actually was started to show something as a forward at the end of the year, had a 4-goal game against Gold Coast.
He also had some defensive time, didn't he?
He did, but I would like to see him continue at this point as another forward option.
Oh yeah, I'd like to see him as a forward, but like if in a pinch you have to throw him on defense, like yeah, you can live with it. Not the end of the world.
I figure next year Judd McVie will get taken onto the main list. Started this year very well. Strong one-on-one defender. Used more in the middle as the year went on. Now we'll have to see, with hopefully a more replenished midfield in some respects, does he return to defense? I think about the job he did on Jake Stringer as being the highlight of his year.
He was mostly a positive. He had a couple of quieter games, but for a player at his age and where he is in his development cycle, like you feel pretty good about his season.
By the way, another reason why I would like to see Turner and also Petty continue forward is because somebody needs to take on that defensive forward job with Jake Melksham aging out very soon. Every team needs those full field marks. Every team needs 3 capable wings, honestly. Well, Melbourne, maybe it's only 2 because Ed Langdon will just play the entire game. But every club, I think, also needs someone who can play that defensive forward role. And Jake Melksham is 32. But it's all going to start with quelling the storm internally. If that can be done, maybe something can be salvaged for the next 2 years. If not, heads could roll as soon as next month.
That's really not an optimistic way to end this, but what I like about this is we've kind of had that mix of things to be encouraged by, things that are disappointing,
and then a snap back to reality at the end. And for Melbourne, yeah, gravity has gone.
And I guess our next episode, we get to talk about the 3 very bottom teams. Actually, what, 4 very bottom?
The 4 very bottom plus a team that was in the bottom 6 before the last round.
All right. And there are a couple of teams there that I really have a lot to talk about. So I look forward to that. I feel like this was a good episode. I feel like this was just done appropriately. Like, we paced it pretty well. Yeah, I don't think we dragged too much. Only a couple times where I felt like I was being redundant. Like I've said many times, we appreciate your feedback, whether it's very tiny pedantic stuff or very big things. Like, any engagement is good.
And honestly, if people are disagreeing with us, then we're probably doing something right.
Because that means you care.
Thanks, Basil?
Kind of, yeah. Kind of what I was getting at. You're not always going to agree with us.
Well, follow us everywhere at Americans Footy. I don't think anybody else is going to be taking that handle anywhere, so it's going to be us. It's not like somebody taking the Sov Megafan 4, which someone did. Individually, I'm at BenjaminHK01. He is at Castle Media, and now I'm pointing at the cat. He is at Cat Named Grind on Instagram. Good time of day. Watch AFLW. Talk to y'all again soon.